Hi, I'm Nick, and I have some really stupid ideas for Star Wars. Okay, so I think part of the reason that people have a problem with the sequel trilogy is that it's basically violating everything that they've come to believe is factual about the characters that they've come to love. You know, Luke Skywalker doesn't act the way that Luke Skywalker does in the Legends series, but by the same token, we're being given less information about why these people are the way they are now. I mean, yes, we were told that Luke looked into Ben's heart and saw what he would eventually become, and for a split second, let that darkness envelop him to the point where he actually did consider killing his own nephew, even though, he immediately walked it back and felt great shame about it. And to me, I think Luke had a pretty rich character arc in that it's him coming to terms with his role as this larger than life mythological figure. But I feel like there's a way that you can get there without having to make so many people angry. And yes, I know the onus is on the Star Wars fan base, of which I have been a lifelong member, to be less toxic. I mean, you can be mad or you can be disappointed, but there's no reason that people need to bully Kelly Marie Tran off of social media. I mean, that's ridiculous. And so there's a million different things going on with Star Wars that cause people to just sort of act crazy because they marry so much of their identity to these movies, when in reality, I think when you say you like Star Wars, when most people say they like Star Wars, what they really mean is that they like three movies. They like A New Hope, they like Empire, and they like Return of the Jedi. Or you could remove Return of the Jedi and just put Revenge of the Sith. But for the most part, and this isn't including the spin-offs either, which are decent movies. I mean, I loved Solo, but I love all Star Wars. My objectivity isn't what it should be as a critical voice. But then again, I'm not really trying to be a critical voice. What I'm trying to say is that there are ways to sort of rewrite the sequel trilogy while keeping the majority of the themes and arcs intact and minimizing the amount of fanboy outrage that I think you would have gotten otherwise, But then again, you're probably going to get it regardless. I mean, let's be realistic here. People are going to find a reason to be mad about anything. People are going to find a reason to be mad about this video, even though these are plans that have no chance of ever happening, because I'm not a screenwriter, and I'm not saying that my idea is in any way better than what they're doing, or that I could write something better than J.J. Abrams or Rian Johnson or Chris Terrio or anybody who's had control of recent Star Wars scripts. I'm just offering some ideas. So with that preamble that makes no sense out of the way, my idea is to essentially reshape the central conflict of the sequel trilogy. A lot of people's issue with the sequel trilogy is that it's kind of a retread of Rebels versus Empire. And granted, it's Star Wars, so each trilogy is kind of about a different war. But this sequel trilogy almost needed to be a more intimate, smaller conflict. I mean, not smaller. That's not... In scale, yes, but it doesn't mean that the stakes are lower. And it doesn't mean that there's any less world building. If anything, I think we should see more planets, more alien species, even if it's just in passing. But first and foremost, conflict-wise, I wanted to create a villain who has a goal that is different from the goals of just about every other villain in the Star Wars saga, at least from a canon perspective. Now, I didn't realize at the time when I came up with this idea that it's already been done in Knights of the Old Republic 2. This is what the villain in that game wanted to do. But I came at it from a perspective of what is one thing about Star Wars that everyone can agree is cool, other than lightsabers and Han Solo. What's the one aspect of the Star Wars universe that almost everyone can fundamentally agree upon? And for me, that's the Force. Even people who don't really like Star Wars would love to be able to have the Force, to be able to access it, to be able to use those abilities, to see things before they happen, to move things with your mind, to be able to block out negativity, in all its many, many forms. So a great villain with a different motivation for these movies would have the goal of wanting to kill the Force. Now, killing the Force is kind of a bad way of putting it. It's more like the villain would want to be able to sever our connection, organic connection to the Force. How would they do this? So in my version of this, now, keep in mind, I'm doing this by trying to make as few changes as possible. So we still have Finn, we still have Rey, we still have Poe, and we still have Kylo Ren. But in this scenario, I kind of view it as we have no Snoke. It's more Kylo Ren teaming with the Knights of Ren, who are Luke's former students in this one, which I imagine they will be in Episode 9 anyway, coming together as sort of a heretical anti-Force order, in the sense that Kylo Ren is sort of looking at the Force as something that has caused great strife within his bloodline. The Force chose Anakin, and in so doing, through a very Rube Goldberg-esque kind of way, led to a civil war that caused grief and anguish for millions and billions of people. And then, because when darkness rises, light rises to meet it, we get more war because of the Skywalker bloodline, which is basically driven by the Force. And then Ben sort of feels like it's his destiny to carry on the burden of the Skywalker bloodline because they were chosen by the Force. Powerful light, powerful dark. It's just destiny that no matter what Ben does, whether he goes to the light or the dark, he's going to have an equal rise up to challenge him. And so the only way to prevent this is to sever organic beings' connection to the Force. So this would be Ben teaming up with the Knights of Ren to sort of track down the first Jedi Temple, which he views as the origin of the Force. In this story, he's not looking for the first Jedi Temple because he thinks Luke Skywalker is there. He's looking for the Jedi Temple because he thinks that he can somehow wound the Force there and cut off our connection to it. Meanwhile, the good guys in this story are looking for the first Jedi Temple because Luke has been in a Force coma ever since Kylo Ren destroyed Luke's Jedi Academy. For whatever reason, Luke has been cut off from the Force and he just hasn't been able to return. You don't even have to go into the whole world between worlds type thing. Just know that for the most part, Luke is out of commission for this movie. And The Force Awakens can more or less proceed as it has been. You could even go with a First Order superweapon because clearly Kylo Ren is going to need funding, but instead of having it be another Death Star, it could just be like a Star Destroyer that's more powerful than a normal Star Destroyer. This creates kind of a narrative urgency in the sense that both parties are trying to get to the first Jedi Temple. It's almost like a race, but we also know why they're trying to get there. The bad guys think that they can accomplish their goal of severing our connection to the Force by destroying the first Jedi Temple. Meanwhile, the good guys think that they can snap Luke back out of his Force coma if they place him in the rejuvenative waters beneath the first Jedi Temple. See, this is me repurposing that dark side cave from The Last Jedi for this. See, instead of a dark side cave, it's just a sort of wellspring of pure Force energy in a way. And this also kind of fits in with a J.J. Abrams type mentality, because he did this same thing with Lost, with the healing pool in a temple, and of course some people would say it would be better if Star Wars were less like Lost, and I don't necessarily disagree, so whatever. But long story short, both parties converge at the first Jedi Temple. Luke comes back once he's revived from his Force coma. Kylo Ren destroys the first Jedi Temple, but finds out that he's only really wounded the Force. You know, he hasn't really severed the connection, which goes along the lines of what happens in Knights of the Old Republic 2, in that the villain there only really causes a wound in the Force, if I remember correctly. And they realize that in order to sever the connection to the Force, they need to create a bigger wound. And that's kind of where the conflict escalates in Episode 8, which I don't have any ideas for, because the grand extent of my ideas pretty much begins and ends with one movie. Because for all the rewriting and presupposing that I would like to do, I'm actually not that smart at things like this. But it also comes from a point of enjoying the sequel trilogy for what it is and not feeling that a lot of it has to be fixed. Rey and Finn's friendship more or less goes down the same way. And, you know, you could even have Rey... Well, okay, I wouldn't have Rey beat Kylo Ren because that somewhat lowers the stakes. I mean, if Luke beat Darth Vader in A New Hope in a lightsaber duel, then there isn't as much drama going into Empire, you know, and it's just generalized storytelling. Now, I know that they want to subvert expectations, but at some point you're forgetting to tell a story and you're just subverting expectations to subvert them, which is just silly. Ultimately, I think it's not, calling this a rewrite of The Force Awakens is a misnomer, because I haven't really rewritten anything. I mean, I've left it more or less as it is, but changing some of the dynamics. Now, granted, it's easy for me to sit here and armchair quarterback. Is that even a term? The whole saga so far, especially because I don't know how it ends, because I don't know how episode 9 is going to go. So I'm just spitballing ideas, but at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of room for interesting stories within the sequel trilogy without having to change giant swaths of it. It doesn't have to be as complicated as maybe some people wanted it to be, but it also doesn't have to be as simplistic either. I mean, Rey can still be a nobody, or she could be somebody's daughter, but I kind of like that she's nobody because it has that contrast between Kylo Ren being from this great bloodline and Rey being essentially no one from nowhere. And it also further contrasts with Kylo Ren's storyline in that he's trying to escape the burden of the Skywalker bloodline and its connection to the Force, whereas Rey is essentially searching for the place she belongs and the people with whom she belongs. Like, Rey wishes she had a family with a bloodline and with a legacy, that she could maybe understand her place in the story. And I feel like that's not me, like, coming up with anything. I think that that narrative through line is very clearly in the movies that we have right now. I also like the idea of Rey as this anti-Luke, in the sense that in A New Hope, all Luke wanted to do was leave Tatooine, but in The Force Awakens, all Rey wants to do is stay on Jakku. It's the difference between people who go out searching for their destiny and others who have it thrust upon them. It's kind of a reimagining of the hero's journey, in that you have the refusal to the call, which, again, that was true for Luke and it was true for Rey. They initially get that call to adventure and they initially refuse it. And I would leave all those things intact for a rewrite of The Force Awakens, but ultimately those are the only things that I would change, is changing the villain's motivation and sort of the backstory surrounding it. And I would also give that explanation for why Luke is out of commission, because I don't like, yes, there is an arc there for Luke, and it does give him a fully rounded, somewhat richer arc to play than if he were just the Luke from the Legends, who was out there being benevolent and all-powerful and infallible. But at the end of the day, it still didn't entirely feel like Luke Skywalker to me. So just put him in a coma, then have him wake up and figure out where he is as a character from there. But don't have him do this thing that is somewhat out of character for him and then just have him drop off the face of the earth. Because, see, but now I'm becoming that fanboy who's very defensive of what he thinks these characters are and doesn't want to allow for the possibility that they aren't who we thought they were. But sometimes in fairy tales, you just want known quantities to be those known quantities. You want characters to act the way that you think they always have and always would and always will. So I get why people were upset, and I get why people aren't as hyped for episode 9, but I'm hyped for episode 9 regardless of what they do with it. I mean, I'm gonna love Star Wars until the day they put me in the ground. I grew up with this, and whatever they do with episodes 7 through 9, like, that doesn't take away 4 through 6 for me, or 1 through 3, because I loved those movies in their own way too. I don't know. I guess I'm sort of straddling the line between a Star Wars apologist and someone who is also sort of voicing his grievances. But at the end of the day, I mean, Star Wars is Star Wars is Star Wars. And I am just happy that I get to live in a time where I get to share my love of Star Wars with my nephew. And we get to go see Star Wars movies on the big screen together, and neither of us know what's going to happen. And I don't know. It's just a great thing, because I was kind of, I don't know. I just like Star Wars. So let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear your ideas, anything that you have to say, or anything that you think would work for the sequel trilogy, even discarding rewrites, just things that you think could happen in episode 9 or should happen in episode 9. And yeah. Maybe I'll do another one of these for something else sometime, but I don't know. This was kind of a spur of the moment thing. It just popped into my head, and I wanted to kind of talk to you guys. So anyway, have a good one.